Hello and welcome to another episode of TV on TV. Today is Thursday, March 4th. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group. It's going to be, it's another cold day, but the weather's getting better. I've got some news, and then I've got Marty Rosenthal, co-chair of Brookline PAX, in an interview recorded before today, just a few days ago. My facial hair was a little shorter. Let's do some news and then we'll get right to it. The first thing I'd like to do is just remind folks, look, call me anytime if there's something I can do to be helpful to you. My telephone is 617-872-8921. That's the best place to reach me if you have something that you need work on right away. If you're more interested in lobbying for a policy or something like that, email is great, tommy.vitolo@mahouse.gov. So let's do national, then local, then state. Nationally, the United States House of Representatives passed a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. There is individual checks. There is money for cities and towns, states. There is extended unemployment benefits, food aid, expanded tax credits for Americans with low incomes, and an increase of the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15, although the rumor is that that part will not survive the Senate. President Joe Biden has been clear he wants all teachers to receive at least one dose of the vaccination by the end of March, and he believes that all Americans will be able to have one dose of the vaccine by the end of May, many months ahead of this schedule we had imagined under the prior president. This advancement, lots of good reasons for it. The most recent is that the J&J vaccine, which is a one-dose vaccine, has been approved for emergency use. Here in Massachusetts, and I think in response to President Biden's insistence, the governor has deemed that teachers will be vaccinated sooner rather than later. In fact, on March 11th. Unfortunately, his method of doing so is to just tell the teachers to find a local pharmacy and get in line, rather than allow cities and towns, their employers, to administer those vaccines locally using boards of health and firefighters and other services. So I think that's it's good news on the whole. Could have been handled a little better. Tax collections in the state continue to be well ahead of projections. In fact, most recent tax collections were ahead of last year. The reason for this is, frankly, the incredible strength of the federal government. The checks to individuals, the unemployment, the PPP loans, all of those are taxable, right? And so organizations and individuals in the state who receive that money are paying tax on it. And of course, there's additional money that went directly to the state. And those things in conjunction are pointing to a robust budget this coming year. I expect a significant contribution will be made to the rainy day fund to replace what was taken out, recognizing that next year's budget, the one that we will be talking about a year from now, will not have all of those benefits from the government, the federal government there, and may be a little shortened. So I think there'll be a little bit of a sense to put some money away for not the rainy next year, but not the year next year that has as much support from the federal government. The Massachusetts House of Representatives has extended COVID-era voting regulations to the end of June. That specifically extends mail-in regulations until the end of June, but that hasn't made its way through the government entirely. It's not clear if it will. Secretary Galvin has been clear. If you are afraid of catching or transmitting COVID, you can vote absentee. And so if that's the way you want to vote, if you don't want to vote in person, go ahead and pursue the absentee ballot process. That is perfectly fine. Of course, the town election in Brookline is Tuesday, May 4th. Finally, at the state level, self-described Reagan Democrat Jeff Turco has won a special election in Winthrop and Revere to fill the seat vacated by the abruptly retiring former speaker, Bob DeLeo. To be clear, he did not resign under scandal. He simply took a job at Northeastern, feeling like his time as speaker had come to a natural close. Locally, not too much news. We're grateful that State Treasurer Deb Goldberg has recovered from COVID, and she is grateful for all of the well wishes she received. The school committee votes today on a new superintendent, and the sole finalist is Dr. Linus Gilroy. He comes from Lowell by way of several other communities and NASA, amazingly enough. That's all the news to print. We're going to go right to Marty Rosenthal, co-chair of Brookline PAX, and learn more about that organization. Thanks for watching. And as promised, today we've got Marty Rosenthal, co-chair of Brookline PAX, and we're going to talk about PAX and what PAX is all about. And of course, full disclosure, I am a board member of PAX, so I may pretend like I don't know some of these answers, but maybe I do. We'll find out. We'll see what Marty has to say. Marty, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks very much for having me on behalf of all the Brookline PAX Board of Directors.
So let's get started. Tell us, what is this PAX thing all about?
Well, it was started actually in 1962 when I was a sophomore at Brookline High, but I was the opposite of political. I was more interested in basketball than anything, frankly. And it was started by particularly a woman named Ethel Alper, and secondarily her husband Ben, who taught sociology at BC. And Ethel, I'm actually glancing at the history right now to make sure I have the date right. It started actually as an anti-nuclear organization. And Ethel had a history of the Spanish Civil War and the Howard Hughes campaign, which actually was part of the beginning of a lot of liberal activity in Massachusetts. I think that's 1962, to ban nuclear weapons. And there was also something called Massachusetts Political Action for Peace, which is, by the way, what PAX originally was an acronym for, Political Action for Peace. And PAX was a predecessor of Mass Political Action for Peace, and that later became CPPAC, Citizens for Participatory Politics, which was an outgrowth of the Gene McCarthy campaign in 1968. And ever since then, and there are still some survivors of that period of the 60s that are active in town affairs, not too many. It's been active in local affairs and national affairs and state affairs. And one of the big things we do is, and I started with PAX in the late 70s, recruited by someone who I think you know, named Joanne Blumsack. It was in my neighborhood. I grew up and went to devotion school, KI, and lived in Abbotsford and Fuller, and she lived on Fuller. And I was involved in anti-development stuff with Herb Goodwin. I came back from law school in California and found Dexter Park plunked on the site of a beautiful old school and a beautiful ball field, a private school. And I was horrified. And North Brookline ever since has been fighting against overdevelopment and big buildings and losing green space. So I started going to PAX meetings, and next thing you know, I became chair. I think that's around 82 or 83 or so. And they were doing things like endorsing candidates. And already back then, they would recruit people for town races and do an endorsement process. And even back then, before computers, they had a written questionnaire that they would ask people to fill out. There weren't very good voting records back then, and that became a priority for PAX in the 80s and 90s to get more roll call votes so we'd know how people voted. And now we have a lot of them. But back then, people would just have to use word of mouth and observations about Brookline's town government, which, as all your listeners must know, is 240 elected legislators, town meeting members from 16 precincts, and along with some other at-large members, including yourself and the select board and a couple of others. So it's a pretty hurly-burly form of government, which I personally love, even though sometimes it can be nasty. But
You talked about anti-nuclear weapons, and you talked a little bit about development from decades ago. What are the issues that are important to PAX in 2021?
okay, although let me step back on that and just get back to history, because the biggest thing in the 80s and actually late 70s before I began was rent control. And that was a central issue. PAX was a supporter, and rent control was supported by, back then, an active tenant group in Brookline called the Tenant Union, and liberal homeowners like myself and Herb Goodwin, Sumner Kaplan, Jack Backman, et cetera. So that was the big divisive issue up until 1988, when the real estate industry and some affluent homeowners got rid of all of us and rent control. So getting back to your question, more recent issues, and PAX does one more thing other than the endorsements, which is we take positions on not just local candidates, but statewide candidates like you. Well, you're not statewide, but you're a state office holder. But we even endorse for positions like, especially for a Democratic primary, we take positions on candidates statewide. And we also write a letter to town meeting members at every town meeting, taking positions on the warrant articles. And now we don't mail it, we do it electronically. But for years, that's been part of what we do. And frankly, we've done pretty well with town meeting over the years and with our endorsements. Although the interesting twist on the endorsements, merging history and current events, is that ever since that 1988 election, when they threw out me and Estelle Cates and a third of town meeting and another third the next year because of rent control, with the help of $100,000, we had trouble getting people elected to townwide office. Little by little, we took back the town meeting with liberals and progressives. But townwide was a bigger challenge for us because money has more influence there. And then the last 6, 7, 8 years, we've had a more liberal board of selectmen as well. Now called.
I'm gonna pull you back to the question though, which is what are some of the issues that PAX in 2021 is active around?
So the last few years, we've been involved in some very controversial issues, and on a lot of them, people have gotten much to what I call litmus test, and we've had people that overreact, that say, what's happened to PAX? The very first of those was actually 2016, when we were frustrated with the school committee, and we endorsed 0 people for re-election, even though the incumbents were unopposed. And then we had things like we supported the Baldwin School to have a 9th school in Brookline, which has been an issue for a decade. And on that one, we made some enemies in South Brookline. And then a couple of years ago, we supported the marijuana dispensary called Netta, the first one in Greater Boston. And they were kind of overwhelmed by business, and they were a nuisance to the neighborhood because they were the only one. And some Brookline people, I think, overreacted to the fact that it was a temporary thing and that there were remedial measures that the town did do. And they wanted to make it more difficult for Netta to operate. So we opposed that. And we made more enemies on that one. And then comes a lot of racial and police stuff. And that's been the hottest issue for the last year, ever since actually the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. And that's been a fascinating lesson in politics in general. And by the way, I not only have a law degree, but I got a master's in poli-sci. So I learned a lot more by being in politics than I did in graduate school. But I do study politics quite a bit. And on the race and police issues, what's happened is kind of ironic to me, is that a lot of very well-intentioned people that want to fight racism and are fighting racism have, I think, gone a little too far in terms of not particularly factual representations about Brookline and about exaggerating the problems in Brookline. And it's created quite a bit of strife, both in town meeting and in the community. And I think it's been bad for the community because I think the people I'm talking about exaggerate how bad things are in Brookline. And I'm not saying things are wonderful in Brookline. I just think Brookline is better on these issues, including police issues, which I'll hopefully get to in a minute, 2 minutes.
Yeah, and I want to drill down on that a little bit. I think that there are many people on the left who have been surprised that PAX hasn't been as aggressive around the Gerald Alston case. And my understanding is there's actually some good reasons for that, as they relate to Stanley Spiegel, as they relate to other folks involved in lawsuits. And I think it would be really helpful. We don't have time for the long form version, but to spend a few minutes explaining how PAX came to land where it has landed around the Gerald Alston case.
Yeah, and I'm very eager to do that because I think it is widely misunderstood, as I believe the case is. But before I forget, in 10 seconds, I have to acknowledge Neil Gordon, who's the secretary for PAX, and without him, we'd be nothing. And he took over the Frank Farlow, who died much too young about 5 years ago. And Neil is only called secretary because that's to stay on the advisory committee. If he were co-chair, as Frank was, Sandy Gatsby would have asked him to not be on the advisory committee. So I thank Neil right here and now. So getting back to the question, the first thing is that PAX has a history the first couple of years of abstaining on the Alston case and staying out of it and telling town meeting members, trying to say why, although I don't think most of them cared or misunderstood or understood or listened. We have several people involved in the case. One defendant in the case is a longtime PAX board member, Stanley Spiegel, and I am his lawyer, along with two friends of mine of the law firm I share space with. So he was a defendant. He also is fighting for the town to get his legal fees paid, which I believe he's 100% entitled to. So we're in the middle between the plaintiff, Alston, and his lawyer, Ames, and then the town on the other hand. Plus, there are town defendants, two of them. One is currently a PAX board member, Nancy Heller, and another was a PAX chair, that was Jesse Mermel. So we felt we should just keep our mouths shut on the case because we had personal interests and it just didn't seem right. So the other problem was that once we finally decided we have to speak out, it was a most recent couple of town meeting votes to defund the Alston litigation. And we felt, and the PAX board felt, and everything we do is by a 60% vote of those present at a meeting, as you know. The PAX board felt that the attempt to say that town meeting mandates that this case cannot continue. It's a case in state court. There are two separate cases. The case against Stanley in federal court has been dismissed, and that was just affirmed in the First Circuit as being a frivolous lawsuit. And we're waiting the frivolous part is a separate decision, which we're waiting to get a decision that got $20,000 sanctions imposed on Mr. Ames. But the point is that the recent articles to end the litigation, we felt were an improper governmental intrusion by town meeting into litigation, and litigation is always discussed in executive session by the select board. So the town meeting members were not able to know what's going on in those cases, but they have what I will call a litmus test support for Mr. Alston. Now, one last thing on this, and I know I've gone on at too much length, is that nobody that I know, none of my friends, including myself and Stanley, agree at all with the initial instigation of the Alston case. Obviously, the voicemail was a horrible thing. And we also disagreed with, always we disagreed with the promotion of Lieutenant Pender. So, but to lump us in with the town defendants who are accused of those things, especially the promotion of Pender, and then retaliation in the fire department, which is a matter of dispute. I think we've been lumped in with them as being the bad guys. And it's really been very unfair to Stanley, and I'm still fighting his fight. So we stayed out of that for a while, and then once we opposed the ending of the litigation, we got further accused as being part of the racist conspiracy. And I think that people should really look at the actual cases to see that they're more complicated than the people who know nothing more than the voicemail and the promotion. Now, on police issues, that too has become complicated because there's been a very wonderful reaction to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. There was just another one in yesterday's New York Times, a case, Aubrey, what's the last, Aubrey, I forget the last name, but there's been a rash of these cases all across the country of especially African Americans being shot and often killed by police. And usually every one of them that I've seen looks like a horrendous occurrence that should never have happened. And so that's created a wonderful nationwide movement, Black Lives Matter, etc., which has luckily seeped into Brookline. But the problem is that there are some people in Brookline that think our police department is as bad as Minneapolis and Louisville, and it just isn't. So now we have two committees going on, and I'm on one of them, a reform committee. There'll be a report to the select board tonight that's making a lot of reforms. In fact, we're proposing, and I think the board will go along with this, a new advisory committee to monitor police issues 12 months a year, and also be involved more in the complaint process, which I had a hand in putting in place in 1987, which is basically a civilian review, but by the select board after an internal affairs investigation. So we'll have a new committee to really hold their feet to the fire, hear from the public, and deal with police issues. So that will be a good outcome. But we were not in favor of massive cuts in the police budget that paid no concern at all to what would be cut from the police budget. And that's what we went through last June at town meeting. And I was relieved that those things did not pass, but we got in more trouble for that we're not supporting. They didn't use the defunding word, but as you know, that word means different things to different people, but we did not support those massive budget cuts. And
I think it would be helpful for viewers. You have this challenge where you're talking about PAX as a singular entity, but of course, PAX is an organization made up of people, many of whom are town meeting members, and of course, PAX endorses candidates, and there are town meeting members who are members of PAX. When you say PAX did not support a position, what does that mean in terms of people who are endorsed by PAX or people who are on the board? Does that mean that there's just a uniform, everybody votes a particular way? How does that play out in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. What it means is pretty simple. It means that 60% of the board members that were present at a meeting that something was discussed, that's the only way a position gets taken. And it means that PAX as an organization abstained on the first Alston vote, later opposed the defunding, and then later opposed the budget cuts. Now, however, everyone on the board has a right to vote differently, and many people do, including the board members. We have a big board. It's now 45 or 50 people. It includes not just yourself, but 2 former state representatives, several former select board members like me, and people have a right to not only vote differently, but also they sometimes speak differently. I try to be careful not to do that because I'm kind of identified with PAX more than I'd like to be. And I know that it's hard to say I'm only speaking for myself, not for an organization when you are the titular head. So anyway, I do it once in a while, but not very often. So we're not monolithic. Uh, we have some remnants of the 1960s. We don't have bylaws. We don't have minutes. We keep our meetings private. We got burnt by public meetings. And it was Frank Farlow and I about 10 years ago that felt we had to end that. And so our board meetings are closed to the public. And we try to keep our board conversations among us rather than get debated publicly, because almost nobody outside the meetings knows what really happened. So does that answer your question about the members?
Yeah, and so we talked a little bit about racial justice and policing. We talked, we mentioned schools. We mentioned the marijuana dispensary. Earlier, we talked about development. What do you think is the next issue in town government that PAX is going to be involved in? Something that maybe isn't here yet, but is coming?
I try not to duck any question. I'm not going to duck that one, but there's one thing I forgot to mention on the race stuff. Something else that I think has been pervasive in the community is misunderstanding a couple of police cases, these Arai and Pilot cases. And both of them had celebrated complaints about the police department in early 2016. And they were the subject of a major public hearing in which people rounded up to support them. And that too has become a similar problem to Alston. They are canonized in the community, but how many people know that their allegations have been retracted when they settled the cases? The most serious one was Officer Zarai, who said he did not feel safe in the police department, and he signed an affidavit for his settlement saying that that was a mistake. He should not have said that. And Pilot said, there's a difference of opinion on who said what, and I realize it cannot be proven. It was an accusation that somebody said something about jumping jacks with the N word, and the person accused said he had said something different. But the point is that from these cases, people conclude that Brookline's an awful place on race. And I don't think that's true. And I think that by saying that, they're making it harder for Brookline to attract diverse visitors and residents. And that gets me back to your question, because I think the biggest question that we're facing right now, the police and race stuff is going to continue, but an adjunct to that is the housing issue. And the fact that we are, and I've seen this, becoming we've become slowly a much too exclusive community. And it's because of the housing prices. And, when I grew up here, we basically had very few people of color. We had Jews and Catholics and WASPs. And that was about it. I had two African Americans in my Brookline high class. And we're doing better now, but with the end of rent control, the town has become much too exclusive, and that's a big issue. And that's going to raise issues of zoning and development, which are tough issues in Brookline because we're a very dense community. The North Brookline area, I think, competes only with Somerville in terms of density in Massachusetts.
That's right. Although if we start picking subdivisions of other communities, we can find subdivisions of other communities that are more dense than North Brookline.
But this is a big subdivision of Brookline. It's probably 10
well, for sure.
More
right?
than half.
If you take Somerville and exclude the university space, for example, Somerville looks a lot denser, right? And North Brookline doesn't really have a lot of university space or any big parks or any bodies of water of substantial size. In any case, Marty, I really appreciate you coming on the show. You've been watching Brookline Interactive Group, TV on TV. We've been speaking with Marty Rosenthal, co-chair of Brookline PAX. And, as always, great show. We'll see you again next week. Can I get in 20
more seconds?
No, we're done, Marty. We gotta cut it.
All I want is more civility and everyone to respect each other better.
I think we're gonna get there. I think we've all got to work at it, and I'm optimistic. Marty, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all your good work.